When you've lost everyone you've ever loved, your dog becomes more than a pet. They become your family. Your reason to get up each morning. Your heart walking around outside your body. Margaret Henderson knew this truth better than most as she ran her weathered fingers through Daisy's golden fur during their quiet evening together. That's when she felt it. A small, hard lump that made her breath catch in her throat. After 8 years together, Daisy was all she had left in this world. At the vet's office, Dr. Williams examined the growth with gentle hands. But what he found wasn't cancer or a simple cyst. Hidden beneath Daisy's skin was a rusted metal dog tag with a name that made Margaret's heart stop. The tag belonged to her sister Claire's dog, a dog that disappeared 40 years ago. The same week, Claire vanished without a trace. How does a dog tag from 1983 end up inside a dog born decades later? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive home from Dr. Williams' office felt longer than usual. Though Margaret had traveled the same winding country road thousands of times over the decades, her fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the steering wheel, the small plastic bag containing the impossible dog tag resting on the passenger seat like an accusation. Daisy sat quietly in the back, her usual enthusiasm for car rides dampened by the lingering effects of the sedation. Margaret Henderson had lived in the weathered farmhouse at the end of Maple Grove Road for all of her 68 years, save for a brief stint at the State College where she'd earned her teaching degree. The house had been built by her grandfather in 1924. Its bones solid oak and its foundation fieldstone pulled from the very soil where it stood. 3 generations of Hendersons had called it home, though Margaret was now the last. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front porch as she pulled into the gravel driveway. The familiar crunch of stones beneath her tires, a sound that had welcomed her home since childhood. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on the east side, and the white paint had begun to peel near the foundation. But these imperfections only added to its character. Margaret had always believed that a house should show its age honestly, like laugh lines on a beloved face. She helped Daisy from the car with gentle hands, the golden retriever moving slowly but steadily toward the front steps. The dog had appeared on this very porch 8 winters ago, thin and shivering, with no collar and eyes that held secrets Margaret would never know, or so she had thought. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and old wood, with hints of the beef stew she'd prepared that morning in the slow cooker. The living room walls were covered with photographs spanning decades, family reunions, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, but Margaret's eyes always lingered longest on one particular frame. It sat on the mantel above the stone fireplace, a faded color photograph from 1982, showing 2 young women with their arms around each other's shoulders. Margaret had been 26 then, already teaching 2nd grade at Millbrook Elementary, her dark hair pulled back in the practical style she'd favored even in her youth. Beside her stood Claire, barely 18, and radiant with the kind of beauty that made strangers turn for a second look. Claire's blonde hair caught the sunlight like spun gold, and her smile held the confidence of someone who believed the world was full of possibilities waiting to be discovered. They had been more than sisters, they were best friends, confidants, partners in the gentle rebellions that small-town life allowed. Margaret had been the responsible one, the planner, the voice of reason. Claire had been the dreamer, the adventurer, the one who saw magic in ordinary moments. When Claire disappeared in March of 1983, she had taken with her not just her own future, but Margaret's ability to see wonder in the world. The official story was that Claire had run away. At 18, she was legally an adult, free to make her own choices, even if those choices broke her family's heart. The town had whispered about it for months. How Sheriff Henderson's younger daughter had vanished without so much as a goodbye note, leaving behind only questions and the kind of silence that settles over a family like dust on unused furniture. Margaret's father, Thomas Henderson, had been Millbrook Sheriff for nearly 30 years, a man whose sense of justice was as solid and unyielding as the badge he wore. He had conducted the investigation into Claire's disappearance with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to every case. But the trail had gone cold within weeks. No sightings, no phone calls, no trace of the vibrant young woman who had been planning to start college that fall. The years that followed had been marked by a quiet kind of grief, the sort that settles into your bones and changes the way you move through the world. Margaret had thrown herself into teaching, finding solace in the innocence of her students and the rhythm of the school year. Her father had grown more distant, more rigid in his routines, as if structure alone could hold back the chaos that had claimed his younger daughter. When Thomas Henderson died of a heart attack 12 years ago, Margaret had inherited not just the house but the weight of all its unspoken sorrows. She had kept Claire's bedroom exactly as it had been the day she disappeared, the yellow bedspread still smooth, the textbooks for classes she would never attend still stacked on the desk, the corkboard still covered with photos of friends, and ticket stubs from movies they had seen together. Margaret settled into her father's old recliner, the leather worn soft by decades of use, and pulled the plastic bag from her pocket. Through the clear material, she could see the tarnished metal tag clearly now. The name Buster was etched in simple block letters, and beneath it, a phone number that Margaret recognized even after all these years. It had been their home number in 1983. Buster had been Claire's dog, a energetic border collie mix that she had rescued from the side of the road when he was just a puppy. The dog had been devoted to Claire, following her everywhere with the kind of loyalty that only animals seem capable of. When Claire disappeared, Buster had waited by the front door for days, whimpering and refusing to eat, as if he could will her return through the sheer force of his longing. Buster had vanished 3 days after Claire, and Margaret's father had assumed the dog had gone searching for his missing owner. It was a romantic notion that provided some small comfort, the idea that somewhere, Claire and Buster had found each other again, perhaps starting a new life in a distant city where no one knew their story. But now, holding this impossible piece of evidence, Margaret felt the foundations of that carefully constructed narrative beginning to crack. How could Buster's tag be embedded in Daisy's skin? How could a dog tag from 1983 end up inside a dog that hadn't been born until decades later? The questions multiplied like shadows at sunset, each one darker than the last. Margaret had spent 40 years believing in a particular version of the truth, and now that truth felt as fragile as the dried flowers Claire used to press between the pages of her books. Daisy padded over to her chair, still moving carefully, and rested her head on Margaret's lap. The dog's amber eyes held their usual warmth, but Margaret found herself searching for secrets in their depths. What else might be hidden beneath that golden coat? What other pieces of the past had been carried forward into the present? The farmhouse had always been full of history. The creaking floors told stories of countless footsteps. The doorframes bore the pencil marks tracking Claire's growth through childhood. The kitchen windowsill still held the small ceramic bowl where their mother had kept spare buttons before cancer took her when Margaret was 24. But this felt different. This felt like history reaching out with skeletal fingers to drag the past into the light. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she reached for the cordless phone on the side table. She dialed Dr. Williams' number from memory, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar sequence. Williams Veterinary Clinic. This is Susan. Susan, it's Margaret Henderson. Is Dr. Williams still there? Oh, hello Margaret. Yes, he's just finishing up with his last appointment. Is everything all right with Daisy? She's fine, but I need to speak with him about what he found today. It's important. A brief pause. Then Susan's voice returned, professional but kind. Let me get him for you. Dr. Williams came on the line within moments, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had made him a trusted figure in the community for over 2 decades. Margaret, I was hoping you'd call. I've been thinking about that tag all afternoon. Have you had a chance to examine it more closely? I have, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Dr. Williams, this tag belonged to my sister's dog, Claire's dog, from when we were young. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Margaret to wonder if the call had been dropped. Finally, Dr. Williams spoke, his voice carefully measured. Margaret, that would be impossible. The tag was deeply embedded in scar tissue that's at least 5 years old, possibly older. There's no way it could have been there since 1983. I know it sounds impossible, Margaret said, but I'm looking at it right now, and I'm certain. That's our old phone number engraved beneath the name. Another pause. Then, Margaret, I think we need to talk about this in person. There's something else I found during the procedure. Something I didn't mention earlier because I wasn't sure what to make of it. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of something? There were other foreign objects embedded in the tissue, small pieces of metal, possibly jewelry. I removed everything I could find, but I wanted to run some tests before saying anything definitive. The room seemed to tilt slightly around Margaret, as if the earth itself had shifted on its axis. How many other objects? At least 3 distinct pieces. Maybe more. Margaret, I think you should come in tomorrow morning. We need to discuss this properly, and I'd like to show you what I found. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness of her living room, the dog tag still clutched in her palm. Daisy had fallen asleep against her leg, the dogs breathing slow and steady, a comforting rhythm in the growing silence of the house. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending loose leaves skittering across the porch. It was the kind of October evening that reminded you winter was coming, that the long nights and cold mornings weren't far away. But Margaret barely noticed the weather. Her mind was already turning toward the attic, toward the boxers of her father's belongings she had never been able to sort through, toward the possibility that the answers she needed might have been waiting overhead all these years. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, its deep notes echoing through rooms that had grown too familiar with silence. Margaret gently moved Daisy aside and stood, her joints protesting after sitting motionless for so long. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start looking. The attic stairs creaked under her weight, each step a small announcement of her presence to whatever ghosts might be listening. At the top, she pulled the chain for the bare bulb, and the small space filled with harsh yellow light, revealing the accumulated detritus of a family's life: Christmas decorations, old furniture, boxers labeled in her father's careful handwriting. She found what she was looking for in a corner beneath the small window. A metal filing cabinet that she had avoided opening since her father's death. The top drawer was labeled Case Files Active, the second Case Files Closed, and the bottom Simply Personal. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled open the bottom drawer, revealing neat manila folders organized by year. She found 1983. Immediately it was thicker than the others, stuffed with newspaper clippings, police reports, and handwritten notes in her father's distinctive script. But it was the folder labeled Claire Personal Investigation that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the thickest folder in the drawer, and when she opened it, she found page after page of her father's observations, theories, and desperate attempts to find his missing daughter. The first page was a timeline of Claire's final weeks, noting every conversation, every mood change, every detail that might have provided a clue to her disappearance. But as Margaret read deeper into the file, she began to see a different pattern: emerging references to other missing persons, connections to cases that had never been officially linked, theories that painted a far darker picture than a simple runaway story. At the bottom of the folder, she found a hand-drawn map of Millbrook and the surrounding area, marked with symbols and dates that made no immediate sense. Some locations were circled in red, others marked with small X's, and a few bore notations in a code she didn't recognize. Margaret carried the entire folder downstairs, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Whatever the truth was about Claire's disappearance, whatever secrets had been buried with Buster's tag, she was finally ready to uncover them. As she settled back into her father's chair, with the files spread across her lap, Daisy opened one amber eye and regarded her with the patient wisdom that only old dogs possess. Tomorrow would bring answers. Margaret was certain of that. But tonight, she would read every word her father had written, searching for the threads that might finally weave together the tapestry of truth that had been hidden for 40 years. Wind outside continued to rattle the windows, but Margaret no longer heard it. She was already lost in the past, following her father's careful notes down a path that she suspected would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her town, and the sister she had never stopped mourning. Margaret spent the entire night reading through her father's files, the manila folders spread across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle she was finally ready to solve. Each page revealed another layer of Thomas Henderson's private investigation into Claire's disappearance, an obsession that had consumed him long after the official case had gone cold. The timeline he had constructed was meticulous, starting weeks before Claire vanished and extending years beyond. Every entry was dated and cross-referenced, creating a web of connections that painted a picture far more complex than Margaret had ever imagined. Claire hadn't simply disappeared, she had been systematically documenting strange occurrences around town in the weeks leading up to her vanishing. According to her father's notes, Claire had mentioned seeing unusual meetings at the old grain elevator on the outskirts of town. She had asked pointed questions about missing teenagers from neighboring counties. Most disturbing of all, She had expressed concerns about their father's new friends, men who visited the house late at night when they thought Margaret was asleep. By dawn, Margaret's coffee had grown cold and her eyes burned from reading her father's cramped handwriting by lamplight. But she had found something that made her hands shake with a mixture of excitement and dread: a sheriff's badge wrapped in tissue paper, along with a note in her father's handwriting that read, "The truth about what we did. God forgive us all." The badge wasn't her father's official one that had been buried with him. This was older, tarnished, with initials scratched into the back that didn't match her father's name. Beneath it, she found a collection of case files that had never been officially documented. Reports of missing persons that had somehow never made it into the county records. Each file told a similar story: young people, usually in their late teens or early 20s, who had been labeled as troublemakers by the community. Runaways, petty criminals, kids from broken homes who wouldn't be missed right away. All had disappeared within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook over a span of nearly 2 decades. Margaret's stomach turned as she realized what she was looking at. These weren't random disappearances, they were systematic. Someone had been targeting vulnerable young people, and her father's notes suggested he hadn't just been investigating these crimes, he had been involved in them. She found the hand-drawn map again, studying the symbols more carefully in the morning light. The red circles marked locations where people had last been seen. The X's indicated places where personal belongings had been found, and the strange symbol now recognized them as a crude code marking burial sites. 3 locations on the map were circled multiple times in thick black ink. One was the grain elevator where Claire had seen the mysterious meetings. Another was a remote section of Whispering Creek, about 5 miles from town. The third circle was drawn around her own property, specifically the wooded area behind the farmhouse where she and Claire had played as children. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the phone to call Dr. Williams, but before she could dial, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, she could see Mrs. Eleanor Patterson standing on her porch, the elderly woman who had lived next door for as long as Margaret could remember. "Eleanor," Margaret said, opening the door to find her neighbor, wringing her hands nervously. "It's awfully early for a visit." Mrs. Patterson's usual warm smile was nowhere to be seen. Instead, her weathered face showed deep lines of worry, and her pale blue eyes darted nervously toward the files scattered on Margaret's kitchen table. "I heard about your visit to the vet yesterday. News travels fast in a small town. Would you like some coffee?" Margaret asked, though something in Eleanor's demeanor made her reluctant to invite the woman inside. "Margaret, dear, I think we need to talk about what Dr. Williams found, about things that happened a long time ago." Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if afraid someone might be listening. Against her better judgment, Margaret stepped aside to let Eleanor enter. The older woman moved directly to the kitchen table, her eyes scanning the open files with obvious recognition and growing alarm. "Oh, Margaret," Eleanor breathed, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs. "You found Tom's private files. I was hoping they had been destroyed when he passed." "You know about these?" Margaret asked, settling across from her neighbor. "You know about what my father was investigating?" Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for one of the folders, her fingers stopping just short of touching it. "Your father was a good man, Margaret, but he got involved with people who weren't. And when he tried to get out, when he tried to do the right thing, it was too late." "What are you talking about, Eleanor? What people?" The older woman looked up, tears forming in her eyes. "There was a group, back in the 80s, men who thought they were cleaning up the community, getting rid of the undesirable elements. They called themselves the Millbrook Citizens Committee, but it was just a fancy name for vigilantes." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "My father was part of this group. At first, they just ran troublemakers out of town, scared them enough to make them leave. But then things escalated. People started disappearing permanently, and your father realized what he had become part of." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the tissue from her pocket. "He tried to stop it, Margaret. That's why they killed Claire." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. They killed Claire. Who killed Claire? The same men who had been making all those people disappear. Claire found out about the meetings, about what they were doing. She threatened to expose them, to go to the state police. So they silenced her. Margaret's mind reeled as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The dog tag, Buster's tag, how did it end up inside Daisy? Eleanor's face went even paler. Tom told me about that before he died. The group had a way of disposing of evidence, of making sure nothing could ever be traced back to them. They fed remains to animals, scattered pieces across the county. Daisy must have ingested something years ago, before she found her way to you. You're telling me that Daisy has been carrying pieces of my sister inside her all this time? I'm sorry, Margaret. I should have told you years ago, but Tom made me promise to keep quiet. He said it would only cause you more pain, and the men responsible were too dangerous to cross. Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the window to look out at the wooded area behind her house. Are they still alive? These men? Some of them. Tom Willis is still around. He runs the hardware store downtown. Bill Crawford died in a car accident about 10 years ago, but that might not have been an accident. Your father suspected Tom Willis was cleaning up loose ends. Tom Willis, Margaret repeated, the name feeling like poison on her tongue. She had known Tom her entire life, had bought supplies from his hardware store just last month. He had been at her father's funeral, had shaken her hand and told her what a good man Thomas Henderson had been. Margaret, you need to be very careful. If Tom finds out that you know, if he realizes those files still exist. Eleanor's voice broke off as the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the front of the house. Both women froze, listening to the sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch. The doorbell rang once, followed by a firm knock. Margaret, it's Tom Willis. I heard you might have some questions about your father's old cases. Eleanor's face went white with terror. She gathered the files quickly, shoving them into a kitchen drawer. Don't let him in, she whispered urgently. Don't let him see these files. Margaret's heart pounded as she walked to the front door, her father's badge still clutched in her palm. Through the peephole, she could see Tom Willis standing on her porch, but he wasn't alone. Another man stood slightly behind him, someone Margaret didn't recognize. Just a minute, Tom, she called out, buying time to think. She slipped her father's badge into her pocket and tried to steady her breathing when she opened the door. Tom Willis smiled at her with the same friendly expression he had worn her entire life, but now Margaret could see something else in his eyes, a coldness that she had never noticed before. Morning, Margaret. Heard you had an interesting visit to the vet yesterday. Thought you might want to talk about what Dr. Williams found. I'm not sure what you mean, Tom. His smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened slightly. Found some old metal in your dog, didn't he? Sometimes old properties like this turn up interesting artifacts. Wouldn't want you to get the wrong idea about what they might mean. Margaret kept her hand on the door, ready to close it quickly if needed. I appreciate your concern, but I think I can handle whatever Dr. Williams found. I'm sure you can, Tom said, taking a small step forward, but some things are better left buried. Margaret, your father understood that. He knew when to leave well enough alone. The threat in his words was barely veiled, but it was definitely there. Margaret felt Eleanor's presence behind her, the older woman's fear palpable in the morning air. I'll keep that in mind, Tom. Now, if you'll excuse me, I was just having coffee with Eleanor. Tom's eyes shifted to look past Margaret into the house, scanning for signs of the file she had been reading. Of course. You have a good day, Margaret, and remember, some doors are better left closed. After they left, Margaret deadbolted the front door and returned to the kitchen, where Eleanor sat shaking at the table. He knows, Eleanor whispered. Tom knows you found something. You're not safe here anymore, Margaret. Margaret pulled her father's badge from her pocket, studying the scratched initials on the back. Then it's time to finish what my father started. It's time to find out what really happened to Claire. After Eleanor left, promising to call if she saw Tom Willis return, Margaret spread her father's files across the dining room table and began studying the hand-drawn map with new urgency. The crude symbols and notations that had seemed meaningless the night before now carried the weight of terrible knowledge. She found a magnifying glass in her father's old desk and examined each mark carefully. The map covered roughly a 30-mile radius around Millbrook, with particular attention to rural areas and abandoned properties. Some locations were marked with dates going back to the early 1970s, suggesting that whatever her father had uncovered had been happening for far longer than she had initially realized. The grain elevator appeared multiple times in the files, always referenced in connection with night meetings and disposal operations. Margaret realized with growing horror that her father hadn't just stumbled upon this conspiracy, he had documented it methodically, perhaps as insurance against the very men who had ultimately silenced him and Claire. She decided her first step should be the Millbrook Public Library. Miss Chen, the head librarian, had been organizing the local archives for decades and would have access to historical records that might shed light on the missing persons cases her father had documented. The drive into town felt different now that she knew Tom Willis was watching her. Every car in her rearview mirror seemed potentially threatening. Every familiar face held the possibility of hidden malice. The hardware store sat on Main Street like an accusation, its cheerful red awning hiding the dark truth about its owner. Miss Chen greeted Margaret warmly when she arrived at the library, though the librarian's expression grew concerned when Margaret explained what she needed: missing persons records from the 1970s and 1980s. Miss Chen repeated, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. That's rather specific. Is this for some kind of research project? Something like that, Margaret replied, unwilling to reveal the true nature of her investigation. I'm particularly interested in cases that might not have received much media attention. Miss Chen led her to a back room filled with filing cabinets and microfiche machines. The newspaper archives are the most complete source we have. Police records from that period weren't always well preserved, I'm afraid. Margaret spent the next 3 hours scrolling through newspaper microfilm, her eyes straining as she searched for any mention of the missing persons her father had documented. What she found was deeply disturbing: a pattern of disappearances that had been systematically underreported or dismissed entirely. The Millbrook Gazette had run brief articles about several missing teenagers, but each story followed the same template: troubled youth leaves home voluntarily, family concerned but not surprised, no evidence of foul play. The articles were buried on inside pages and never followed up with additional reporting. But it was the obituaries that provided the most chilling evidence. Margaret discovered that several young people listed in her father's files had death notices published months or years after their disappearance, claiming they had died in distant cities under circumstances that were never fully explained. Someone had been creating false documentation to officially close these cases. Miss Chen appeared at her shoulder as Margaret was printing copies of the relevant articles. Finding what you're looking for. More than I wanted to, Margaret admitted. Miss Chen, do you remember anything unusual about missing person cases from that period? Any sense that things weren't being reported accurately? The librarian glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. There were rumors, of course. Small towns always have rumors. But people learned not to ask too many questions about certain topics. What kind of topics? Well, there was talk about a citizens group that dealt with troublemakers in their own way. Most folks figured it was just gossip. But after Claire disappeared, Miss Chen stopped abruptly, realizing what she had said. After Claire disappeared, what? Nothing, dear. I shouldn't repeat old gossip. But Margaret could see the knowledge in the librarian's eyes, the same fearful recognition she had seen in Eleanor's face. Miss Chen, if you know something about what happened to my sister, please tell me. The older woman looked around the empty archive room before speaking in barely a whisper. Your father came here many times in the months after Claire vanished. He was looking through the same records you're examining today. He seemed to be building a case against someone, but he never told me who. Did he find what he was looking for? I think so. The last time he came here, he seemed different. Scared, but also determined. He made copies of everything and told me that if anything happened to him, I should give these records to the state police. Miss Chen paused, wrapping her arms around herself. But when he died, I was too frightened to follow through. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. You still have copies of what he found? Miss Chen nodded slowly. Hidden in my personal files at home. I've been carrying that secret for 12 years, wondering if I was wrong to keep quiet. Would you be willing to share those copies with me? Margaret, if what your father suspected is true, then you're putting yourself in terrible danger by pursuing this. I'm already in danger, Margaret replied, thinking of Tom Willis's thinly veiled threats. The only way out is through the truth. Miss Chen was quiet for a long moment before nodding. Come to my house tonight, after dark. Park around Bach and use the kitchen entrance. I'll have everything ready for you. Margaret left the library with a mixture of anticipation and dread, her father's map burning like a secret in her jacket pocket. She drove home slowly, taking a circuitous route to ensure she wasn't being followed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the familiar landscape, but nothing felt safe anymore. Daisy greeted her at the door, moving more easily now that the surgery was behind her. The golden retriever seemed to sense Margaret's emotional state, staying close as she moved through the house, checking locks and closing curtains. Margaret spent the remaining daylight hours studying her father's timeline, cross-referencing the dates with the newspaper articles she had copied. A pattern emerged that made her stomach turn. The disappearances had accelerated after her father joined whatever group Tom Willis belonged to, suggesting that his involvement had somehow enabled them to operate more efficiently. The worst realization came when she found a notation in her father's handwriting that read, "C. Asking too many questions. Group growing suspicious. May need to take action." The entry was dated just 1 week before Claire vanished. Her father had known Claire was in danger. He had documented the threat, perhaps even tried to warn her, but it hadn't been enough to save her. As darkness fell, Margaret prepared for her clandestine meeting with Miss Chen. She made copies of the most important files from her father's collection, hiding the originals in a fireproof safe her father had installed years earlier. If something happened to her, at least the evidence would survive. The drive to Miss Chen's house took her through the quiet residential streets where she had grown up, past houses where friends and neighbors lived their seemingly normal lives. But Margaret now wondered how many of them knew the truth about what had happened in Millbrook during those dark years. How many had chosen silence over justice? Miss Chen's house was a modest Cape Cod-style home, surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Margaret parked behind the detached garage, as instructed, and made her way to the kitchen door, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The librarian opened the door before Margaret could knock, her face pale but resolute in the dim light from the kitchen. "Come in quickly," she whispered, ushering Margaret inside. On the kitchen table sat a thick manila envelope, its contents representing 12 years of hidden truth. Margaret's hand shook as she reached for it, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her community, and herself. "Are you sure you want to open that?" Miss Chen asked softly. "Once you see what's inside, there's no going back to the way things were." Margaret thought of Claire's bright smile in that faded photograph, of Daisy carrying pieces of the past in her innocent body, of her father's desperate attempt to document the truth before it was too late. "I'm sure," she said, and opened the envelope. The contents of Miss Chen's envelope confirmed Margaret's worst fears. Her father had documented not just the disappearances, but the methods used to cover them up. Police reports had been altered, death certificates fabricated, and families threatened into silence. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than Margaret had imagined, but it was a photocopy of a handwritten letter that made Margaret's blood run cold. The letter was addressed to their father and signed with Claire's distinctive handwriting, dated just 2 days before she vanished. "Dad," the letter began, "I know you think I don't understand what's happening, but I've been watching and listening. I know about the meetings at the grain elevator. I know about the people who have disappeared, and I know you're involved somehow, even if you didn't mean for things to go this far." Margaret's hands trembled as she continued reading her dead sister's words. "I found Jenny Morrison's necklace in the woods behind our house, the same necklace she was wearing when she disappeared last month. I know what that means, Dad. I know why you've been acting so strange, why you come home late and won't look me in the eye. You have to stop this. You have to go to the state police before someone else gets hurt. I can't be silent about this anymore. If you won't do the right thing, then I will." The letter ended with a plea that broke Margaret's heart. "I love you, Dad, but I can't let this continue. Meet me at the old oak tree tomorrow night so we can figure out how to fix this together. I know you're a good man who got in too deep. Help me help you find a way out." Miss Chen watched Margaret's face as she read, her own expression filled with decades of regret. "Your father never got the chance to meet with Claire that night. The group found out about her letter somehow." "How do you know all this?" "Because Tom Willis came to see me the day after Claire disappeared. He wanted to know if she had been asking questions at the library, if she had access to any records she shouldn't have seen." Miss Chen's voice grew steadier as she spoke, as if finally sharing the truth was lifting a burden she had carried too long. "He implied that bad things happened to people who interfered with community business." Margaret looked up from the letter, fury building in her chest. "And you said nothing." "I was a single woman in my 50s, Margaret. I had no family, no protection. What was I supposed to do against men who could make people disappear?" The anger died as quickly as it had risen. Margaret understood the impossible position Miss Chen had been in, the choice between speaking truth and staying alive in a small town where the wrong people held all the power. "There's more," Miss Chen said quietly, pointing to additional documents. In the envelope, your father documented everything he could in those final months. He knew they were planning to silence him, so he created a record that could speak for him after he was gone. Margaret found a detailed timeline of the conspiracy. Starting in 1971, when a group of local businessmen and law enforcement officials had formed what they called the Millbrook Citizens Committee, their stated purpose was to maintain community standards and address problems the legal system couldn't handle effectively. Initially, they had focused on driving out undesirable elements through intimidation and economic pressure, but as their confidence grew and their methods proved effective, they had begun taking more direct action. By the early 1980s, they were systematically murdering anyone they deemed a threat to their vision of proper community order. The list of victims was longer than Margaret had feared, 23 names over a period of 12 years. All young people who had been labeled as troublemakers, drug users, or simply inconvenient witnesses to the group's activities. Her father's notes indicated that the bodies had been disposed of in various locations throughout the county, often by feeding remains to livestock or burying them in remote areas. Daisy, Margaret whispered, the horrible truth finally sinking in completely. They fed pieces of these people to animals to destroy the evidence. Miss Chen nodded grimly. Your father suspected that some of the remains ended up on your property. The group used it as one of their disposal sites because no one would think to look for evidence on the sheriff's own land. Margaret felt sick as she realized what this meant. For 8 years, she had been caring for a dog that carried the physical remains of murder victims in her body. Daisy had been an unwitting repository of evidence, a living grave for people whose families had never learned what happened to them. I have to call Dr. Williams, Margaret said, reaching for her phone. Wait, Miss Chen cautioned. You need to be very careful about who you trust. The group may be smaller now, but they still have influence in this town. Margaret dialed Dr. Williams' home number, praying that he would be willing to help her navigate this nightmare. When he answered, she could hear the strain in his voice. Margaret, I was hoping you'd call. I've been running tests on the materials I removed from Daisy, and the results are disturbing. How disturbing? The metal fragments aren't just random debris. They're pieces of jewelry, dental work, and surgical implants. Human remains, Margaret, old ones, based on the oxidation patterns. Margaret closed her eyes, the confirmation hitting her like a physical blow. How many different people? Based on the DNA analysis, at least 4 distinct individuals. Possibly more. Some of the samples were too degraded to provide clear results. Dr. Williams, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you told anyone else about these test results? A long pause. I mentioned them to my colleague at the county lab. Why? Margaret's heart sank. Who's your colleague? Dr. Richards. He runs the forensic lab for the sheriff's department. Margaret, what's going on? I'll explain everything when I see you, but right now I need you to trust me. Don't discuss these results with anyone else, especially anyone connected to law enforcement. Can you do that? You're scaring me, Margaret. I'm scared too, but I think we've stumbled onto something much bigger than either of us realized. After hanging up, Margaret looked at Miss Chen with growing determination. I need to search Claire's room. If she was investigating this group, she might have hidden evidence somewhere in the house. Margaret, if Tom Willis suspects you're getting close to the truth, then I need to find proof before he can stop me. Claire died trying to expose these people. I won't let her sacrifice be meaningless. The drive home felt like traveling through enemy territory. Every car that passed seemed potentially threatening. Every shadow held the possibility of watchers, but Margaret's fear was now balanced by a burning need for justice that had been 40 years in the making. At home, Daisy greeted her with the same unconditional love she had always shown, unaware that she carried the remains of murder victims in her body. Margaret knelt beside the golden retriever, stroking her fur and whispering an apology for all the unknowing pain she had endured. Claire's bedroom had been preserved exactly as she had left it, a shrine to interrupted youth and unfulfilled potential. But now Margaret approached it with the eyes of an investigator rather than a grieving sister. If Claire had been building a case against the conspiracy, the evidence would be hidden somewhere in this room. Margaret began with the obvious places: desk drawers, the jewelry box, the books on the shelf. But as she searched, she remembered Claire's talent for finding hiding places that no one else would think to look. As children, Claire had been the master of hide-and-seek. able to disappear into spaces that seemed too small or unlikely to conceal a person. It was the loose floorboard beneath the window that finally yielded results. Margaret pried it up with a letter opener and found a small wooden box containing items that made her heart race. Photographs of the grain elevator taken at night, showing figures loading what appeared to be bogies into trucks, a list of license plate numbers, and most damning of all, a small tape recorder with a cassette still inside. Margaret's hands shook as she pressed play, and Claire's voice filled the room like a ghost speaking from beyond the grave. Claire's voice on the tape was young and frightened, but determined. The recording was dated March 15, 1983, just 3 days before she disappeared. "If someone is listening to this, it means something has happened to me," Claire's voice began, the words sending chills down Margaret's spine. "I've been documenting what I've learned about the group that's been making people disappear from our area. Dad doesn't know I recorded this, but I need someone to know the truth in case they come for me too." Margaret sat on Claire's bed, the same yellow bedspread they had picked out together for Claire's 16th birthday, and listened to her sister describe a conspiracy that was even more horrifying than what she had already discovered. "They call themselves the Citizens Committee, but they're really just murderers with badges and business licenses," Claire continued. "I followed them to the grain elevator last week and watched them dispose of what I'm pretty sure was Maria Cento's body. She's the girl who disappeared 2 months ago, the one everyone said ran away to California." Margaret remembered Maria, quiet girl from a troubled family who had worked part-time at the local diner. Her disappearance had barely made the local newspaper, dismissed as another case of a teenager seeking a better life elsewhere. "Dad got involved with them about 2 years ago," Claire's voice continued. "I think they convinced him they were just trying to clean up the community, get rid of drug dealers and troublemakers. But it escalated. They started targeting anyone who might expose them, anyone who asked too many questions." The tape crackled with static before Claire's voice returned, now even more urgent. "I found a key in Dad's desk, opened something underground. I haven't figured out where yet, but there are maps in his files that show locations around our property. I think they've been using our land as a burial ground, and Dad either doesn't know or is too scared to stop them." Margaret's hands went cold as she realized what Claire had discovered. The underground bunker that the key would unlock was probably somewhere on their property, hidden beneath decades of carefully maintained normalcy. "The worst part is, I think they know I've been watching them. Tom Willis asked me strange questions at the hardware store yesterday, wanted to know if I was planning to go away to college after all. He said sometimes young people got wanderlust and disappeared without warning." The way he said it felt like a threat. Margaret had to pause the tape, overwhelmed by the knowledge that her sister had faced this terror alone. Claire had been trying to protect their father while building a case against his co-conspirators, knowing that discovery would likely mean her death. When she pressed play again, Claire's voice had grown steadier, as if she had made a final decision about her course of action. "I'm going to confront Dad tomorrow night. I've written him a letter explaining what I know and what I need him to do. If he won't go to the state police, then I will. I can't let this continue. Jenny Morrison was only 17, and Maria was younger than me. These aren't disposable people, they're somebody's children, somebody's sisters." The tape ended abruptly, leaving Margaret alone in the silence of Claire's preserved room. She rewound it and listened again, taking notes on every detail that might help her locate the underground bunker Claire had referenced. The key Claire mentioned wasn't in their father's desk anymore. Margaret had cleaned it out years ago, but she remembered finding an odd brass key among his effects, something that didn't match any lock in the house. She had put it in the kitchen junk drawer, assuming it was from an old padlock or storage unit. Margaret found the key exactly where she remembered leaving it, tarnished with age but still solid. It was heavier than a normal door key, and had an unusual shape that suggested it was meant for something more substantial than a typical lock. Armed with her father's maps and Claire's clues, Margaret decided to search the property for signs of the underground bunker. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the familiar landscape, but now every depression in the ground, every unusual mound of earth, seemed potentially significant. Daisy followed her outside, moving carefully, but eager to be active again. The dog's behavior had always been slightly odd around certain areas of the property, places where she would whine softly or refuse to walk, as if she sensed something disturbing beneath the surface. Margaret started with the wooded area behind the house, where Claire had found Jenny Morrison's necklace. The trees here were older, their thick canopy blocking most of the sunlight and creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. She had always loved this area as a child, but now it felt ominous. It was Daisy who found the first sign. The golden retriever stopped abruptly near a cluster of oak trees, whining and pawing at the ground. Margaret knelt beside her and brushed away the accumulated leaves and debris, revealing a subtle depression in the earth about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The shape was unmistakably that of a grave. Margaret's stomach turned as she realized she was probably kneeling above one of the missing persons her father had documented. She marked the location with a stick and continued searching. Following Daisy's lead as the dog moved through the woods with obvious distress, they found 3 more grave-shaped depressions before Daisy led her to a small clearing where a massive boulder sat surrounded by smaller stones. From a distance, it looked like a natural rock formation, but as Margaret examined it more closely, she noticed that some of the smaller stones had been carefully arranged to conceal what appeared to be a metal door set into the ground. The brass key fit perfectly into a hidden lock mechanism, and Margaret's heart pounded as she realized she had found the entrance to her father's secret bunker. But as she prepared to open it, she heard the sound of a car engine coming up her driveway. Through the trees, she could see Tom Willis's pickup truck parked in front of her house. He wasn't alone. 2 other men sat in the cab with him, and Margaret recognized one as the man who had accompanied Tom to her door that morning. Margaret quietly closed the bunker entrance and led Daisy deeper into the woods, using the natural cover to observe the men without being seen. Tom Willis was walking around her house, peering through windows and testing doors. When he found the back door unlocked, he gestured for his companions to follow him inside. From her hiding place, Margaret could hear them moving through the house, opening drawers and closets, clearly searching for something specific. They were looking for her father's files, she realized, and probably any evidence that Claire might have left behind. One of the men emerged from the house carrying the manila folders Margaret had left on the kitchen table, her father's case files that documented the conspiracy. They had found exactly what they were looking for. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message, and she carefully pulled it from her pocket to read. "Margaret, we know you're here somewhere. Come inside so we can talk about this reasonably. Number 1 needs to get hurt." The message was from an unknown number, but Margaret had no doubt it was from Tom Willis. She watched as he stood on her back porch, scanning the tree line where she was hidden. Even from a distance, she could see the cold calculation in his posture, the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. Margaret turned off her phone and led Daisy deeper into the woods, moving as quietly as possible through the undergrowth. She needed to reach the main road and get help, but first she had to escape her own property without being seen. As they made their way through the dense undergrowth, Margaret realized that Tom Willis and his men weren't just searching for evidence, they were hunting her. The systematic way they had spread out around the property, the quiet efficiency of their movements, suggested this wasn't their first time tracking someone who had learned to said much. Margaret's mind raced as she considered her options. The main road was half a mile away through open fields that would leave her completely exposed. Her nearest neighbor was Eleanor Patterson, but involving the elderly woman would only put her in danger. The only safe option was to reach Dr. Williams' office in town, but that meant a 3-mile journey through territory that Tom Willis knew as well as she did. The sound of men calling her name echoed through the woods, their voices growing closer. Margaret pressed herself and Daisy against the trunk of a massive pine tree, holding her breath as footsteps crunched through the fallen leaves just yards away. "She's got to be out here somewhere," one of the men said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Her car's in the driveway and the house is unlocked." "Check the old barn," Tom Willis replied. "If she's smart, she's trying to reach the main road. But we've got that route covered." Margaret's heart sank as she realized they had positioned someone to block her most obvious escape route. These men had experience with this kind of hunt, the deadly patience that came from years of making problems disappear. But they didn't know about the underground bunker, or the evidence it might contain. If Margaret could somehow reach it and document what was inside, she might have proof that even Tom Willis couldn't destroy or explain away. The brass key felt heavy in her pocket as she made her decision. Rather than running away from the danger, she would move toward it. using the bunker as both refuge and arsenal in the fight for truth that Claire had started 40 years ago. Margaret waited in the growing darkness until the sounds of the search moved away from her location, then carefully made her way back toward the hidden bunker entrance. The brass key felt like a lifeline in her trembling hand as she approached the concealed metal door beneath the boulder. The lock mechanism was more complex than she had initially realized, requiring not just the key but a specific sequence of turns to disengage properly. Margaret's father had been thorough in his security measures, ensuring that even if someone found the entrance, they couldn't access it without detailed knowledge of his system. The heavy metal door opened with a soft hydraulic hiss, revealing a set of concrete steps leading down into darkness. Margaret used her phone's flashlight to illuminate the descent. Daisy close beside her as they entered what had been her father's most closely guarded secret. The underground chamber was larger than Margaret had expected, roughly 20 feet square, with concrete walls and a low ceiling supported by steel beams. But it was the contents of the room that made her breath catch in her throat. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls, and a large table in the center held items that could only be described as trophies. Personal belongings of the missing persons filled the space like a macabre museum. Jewelry, wallets, photographs, clothing, each item carefully labeled with a name and date. Margaret recognized some of the names from her father's files, but there were many more than she had expected. The scope of the killings was staggering. On the table sat a collection of letters, all written in different hands but bearing the same desperate tone. Last words from victims who had somehow known they were going to die. Final messages to family members they would never see again. Margaret's hands shook as she read excerpts from these heartbreaking documents. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means they got me. Don't let them tell you I ran away. I would never leave you voluntarily. Look for the truth in the grain elevator. Make them pay for what they've done." The letter was signed by Jenny Morrison, the girl whose necklace Claire had found in the woods. Another letter, this one from Maria Santos, contained detailed descriptions of the men who had taken her and the location where she had been held before her murder. "The sheriff is part of it," Maria had written. "He comes to the meetings and helps plan who disappears next. Don't trust the local police. Go to the state authorities." Margaret realized that her father had been collecting evidence, not just of the murders, but of his own complicity in them. This bunker was both a crime scene and a confession, a desperate attempt to document the truth, even as he was trapped by his own involvement. In the filing cabinets, she found detailed records of each victim, photographs of their final moments, transcripts of forced confessions, even audio recordings of their last words. Her father had been methodical in his documentation, perhaps hoping that someday the evidence would serve justice, even if he couldn't. It was in the bottom drawer of the last filing cabinet that Margaret found what she was looking for, a thick folder labeled Claire Henderson, Personal Investigation. With trembling hands, she opened it to find photographs that made her stomach turn. The pictures showed Claire, bound and terrified, in what appeared to be the same underground chamber where Margaret now stood. The final photographs in the sequence documented her sister's murder in horrifying detail, preserving evidence of a crime that Tom Willis and his associates believed had been buried forever. But it was the audio recording that accompanied the photographs that broke Margaret's heart completely. Claire's voice, brave even in the face of death, confronting the men who had killed so many innocent people. "You can murder me," Claire said on the recording, her voice steady despite her obvious terror, "but you can't murder the truth. Someone will find out what you've done here. Someone will make you pay for all the lives you've stolen." Tom Willis's voice responded, cold and matter-of-fact. "Your father thought he could control this operation, but he's too weak. You're going to disappear just like all the others, and no one will ever know what really happened to you." Margaret had to stop the recording, overwhelmed by the reality of her sister's final moments, but she forced herself to continue, knowing that this evidence was crucial to bringing justice to Claire and all the other victims. The recording revealed that her father had tried to save Claire, had begged the group to let her go in exchange for his continued silence. But Tom Willis and the others had decided that the risk was too great. Claire knew too much and had already begun gathering evidence against them. "Thomas, you brought us this problem," another voice said on the recording. "Your daughter has been snooping around our operations for weeks. We can't let sentiment compromise our security." Margaret recognized the second voice as belonging to Bill Crawford, the man Eleanor had mentioned dying in a suspicious car accident. Her father's desperate pleas for Claire's life were heartbreaking to hear, revealing a man trapped between his love for his daughter and his fear of the monsters he had helped create. The recording ended with the sound of her father sobbing as Claire was led away to her death. Margaret understood now why he had spent the rest of his life documenting the conspiracy's crimes. It was his penance for failing to protect his youngest daughter. But among the evidence of horror, Margaret found something that gave her hope. Her father had been smarter than the other conspirators realized. Hidden in the false bottom of one filing cabinet was a complete set of duplicate evidence photographs, recordings, and documents that proved every murder the group had committed. More importantly, he had included detailed maps showing where all the bodies were buried, not just on their property but throughout the county. With this information, the families of the missing could finally have closure, and the surviving members of the conspiracy could be brought to justice. Margaret heard the sound of voices above ground, Tom Willis and his men continuing their search. For her, she quickly gathered the most crucial evidence into a waterproof bag, including the recordings and photographs that documented Claire's murder. The rest would have to wait. She needed to escape with this proof before they discovered the bunker. As she prepared to leave, Margaret noticed one final item on the evidence tabla, small, digital recorder that appeared much newer than the other equipment in the bunker. Curious, she pressed play and heard her father's voice, recorded just days before his death. If someone is listening to this, it means I'm gone, and the truth needs to be told. Her father's weary voice began. I've spent 12 years documenting the crimes I helped commit, trying to build a case that will bring justice to the people we murdered. Tom Willis thinks he's destroyed all the evidence, but he's wrong. Everything is here, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. The recording continued. I know I can't undo what I've done, can't bring back Claire or any of the others, but maybe their deaths can finally serve a purpose if the truth comes to light. Margaret, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry for all the pain our family caused you. Use this evidence to finish what Claire started. Make them pay for what they did. To her, Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as her father's voice gave her the courage she needed to face what was coming. She had found not just evidence of the conspiracy, but a roadmap to justice that her father had spent years preparing. Now she had to survive long enough to deliver it to the right people. The sound of footsteps above the bunker told her that time was running out. Tom Willis was getting closer to discovering her hiding place, and once he did, she would join the long list of people who had learned too much about Millbrook's deadly secrets. Margaret was preparing to leave the bunker when her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Dr. Williams. She almost didn't answer, afraid that any sound might alert Tom Willis to her location, but something in her instincts told her this call was important. Margaret, Dr. Williams whispered urgently, I just received some test results that change everything. You need to hear this. I can't talk right now, Margaret replied, her voice barely audible. I'm in danger. That's why I'm calling. The DNA results from Daisy's embedded materials. They don't match any of the missing persons from the 1980s. Margaret, these remains are much more recent. Some of them are less than 5 years old. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. That's impossible. The conspiracy ended when my father died. No, it didn't. It's still active, Margaret. Tom Willis has been continuing the operation, and based on the forensic evidence, he's been much more active than anyone in the group ever was. We're not dealing with historical crimes. This is an ongoing murder spree. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had assumed that her father's death had ended the conspiracy, that Tom Willis was simply covering up old crimes. But Dr. Williams' evidence proved that the killing had never stopped it, had accelerated. There's more, Dr. Williams continued. I cross-referenced the DNA with missing persons reports from the past decade. Margaret, Tom Willis has been targeting a much broader range of victims, not just local troublemakers, but anyone who might pose a threat to his operation. Journalists, investigators, even family members of previous victims who started asking questions. Margaret thought of Eleanor Patterson's nervous behavior, of Miss Chen's 40 years of terrified silence. How many people in Millbrook knew the truth but were too afraid to speak? How many had tried to speak and simply disappeared? Dr. Williams, where are you right now? At my clinic. I've been here all evening running tests. Margaret, I think Tom Willis knows about my involvement. Someone broke into my office earlier today, but they didn't take anything obvious. I think they were looking for the test results. You need to get out of there immediately. Take all your evidence and go to the state police. Don't trust anyone local. What about you? Where are you? Margaret looked around the underground chamber, filled with evidence of decades of murder. I'm in my father's bunker, but Tom Willis is searching for me. I have proof of everything: the original conspiracy, Claire's murder, and now I know there are recent victims too. Margaret, listen to me carefully. The forensic evidence suggests that Tom Willis has been disposing of bodies using multiple methods, not just feeding remains to animals. Some of the DNA came from bone fragments that show signs of acid dissolution and high-temperature burning. He's got a sophisticated operation. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Tom Willis hadn't just continued the conspiracy, he had perfected it, turning what had been a crude vigilante operation into a systematic killing machine. The grain elevator, the remote burial sites, even the use of animals for disposal, were just part of a larger system designed to make people vanish without a trace. Dr. Williams, how many recent victims are we talking about? Based on the distinct DNA profiles, at least 8 people in the past 5 years. But that's just what I found in Daisy. There could be many more. Margaret realized that Daisy's appearance at her farmhouse 8 years ago hadn't been random. Tom Willis had been using her property as a disposal site long after her father's death. And Daisy had inadvertently consumed evidence from multiple crime scenes before finding her way to Margaret's door. There's something else, Dr. Williams said, his voice growing even more urgent. One of the DNA samples matches a missing person from just last month. Margaret, Tom Willis killed someone recently, possibly while we've been investigating. Who? A journalist from the state capitol who was researching cold cases in rural counties. Sarah Chunchi's, Miss Chun's niece. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Miss Chen hadn't just been protecting old secrets, she had been living in terror that her family would be targeted for her knowledge of the conspiracy. And her worst fears had been realized when her niece's investigation had brought her too close to the truth. Does Miss Chen know? I don't think so. Sarah was reported missing while visiting relatives in the area, but the family assumed she had extended her stay to continue research. Her body was never found. Margaret understood now why Miss Chen had finally agreed to share her father's files. Her niece's disappearance had convinced her that silence was no longer protecting anyone. It was simply enabling Tom Willis to kill with impunity. The sound of voices above ground was getting closer, and Margaret could hear Daisy whimpering softly. In response to the tension, she needed to escape the bunker before Tom Willis discovered it, but she also needed to ensure that the evidence would survive even if she didn't. Dr. Williams, I'm going to try to reach you, but if something happens to me, you need to know about this bunker. It's on my property, hidden under a boulder in the woods behind the house. The entrance requires a brass key and a specific sequence to open. Inside is 40 years of evidence documenting every murder. Margaret, don't take any risks. Just get out of there. I can't leave yet. There's something else I need to find first. Margaret had realized that if Tom Willis was still actively killing people, there had to be evidence of his recent crimes somewhere in the bunker. Her father's files only went up to his death 12 years ago, but Tom Willis would need to document his own activities for the same reasons her father had insurance against his co-conspirators and leverage, if anyone tried to expose him. She searched through the newer equipment in the bunker and found what she was looking for. A laptop computer, hidden behind one of the filing cabinets. When she opened it, the screen displayed a password prompt, but Margaret noticed that the keyboard showed patterns on certain keys that suggested a numeric password. She tried several combinations, based on significant dates from her father's files before hitting on the right sequence. The date of Claire's murder. The laptop opened to reveal a desktop filled with folders labeled by year, each containing detailed documentation of Tom Willis's continuing crimes. The scope of his operation was staggering. In the 12 years since her father's death, Tom Willis had murdered at least 30 people, including several who had been investigating the original conspiracy. He had expanded his methods to include sophisticated disposal techniques and had developed contacts in other counties who helped him cover up the crimes. Most disturbing of all, he had been keeping detailed records of potential future targets, people whose activities or knowledge made them threats to his operation. Margaret's name was at the top of the most recent list, added just yesterday after her visit to Dr. Williams, but it was the final folder that made Margaret's hands shake with rage and determination. Labeled Current Operations, It contained photographs and planning documents for murders that were scheduled to take place in the coming weeks. Dr. Williams' name was there, along with Miss Chun's and several other people Margaret recognized as longtime Millbrook residents. Tom Willis wasn't just covering up old crimes, he was planning a systematic elimination of anyone who might know the truth about the conspiracy. Margaret realized that her discovery of Buster's dog tag had triggered a final purge, designed to silence all remaining witnesses. The sound of the metal bunker door being tested above ground told Margaret that her time was up. Tom Willis had found the entrance and was trying to force it open, but the evidence she had discovered changed everything. This wasn't just about bringing justice for past crimes, but preventing future murders. Margaret quickly copied the most crucial files from the laptop onto a thumb drive, then used her phone to photograph the most important documents from her father's files. She had enough evidence to expose the entire operation, but only if she could survive to deliver it. As the bunker door began to groan, under increasing pressure from above, Margaret realized that Tom Willis's discovery of her location might actually work to her advantage. He would expect her to be trapped like a cornered animal. But she knew something he didn't. The bunker had a second exit. Her father had been too smart to build an underground refuge with only one way out. In the back corner of the chamber, hidden behind a false wall that appeared to be solid concrete, was an escape tunnel that emerged in the woods nearly a quarter-mile away. Margaret gathered Daisy and the evidence bag, then activated the hidden mechanism that opened the concealed passage. As Tom Willis finally broke through the main entrance above, she was already disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel, carrying with her the proof that would finally bring justice to all of his victims. The escape tunnel was narrow and damp, forcing Margaret to crawl through sections where the ceiling dropped to barely 3 feet high. Daisy followed reluctantly, the golden retriever's natural claustrophobia making her whimper softly in the darkness. Behind them, Margaret could hear the muffled sounds of Tom Willis and his men discovering the bunker's contents, their angry shouts echoing through the underground chamber. The tunnel emerged behind a fallen log nearly a quarter-mile from the house, the exit so well concealed that Margaret might have walked past it hundreds of times without noticing. Her father had been meticulous in his preparations, creating an escape route that could save his life if his co-conspirators ever turned against him. Margaret emerged into the cool night air, gasping and covered in dirt, but alive and free. More importantly, she carried evidence that could finally bring down Tom Willis and expose the full scope of his crimes. The thumb drive in her pocket contained proof of 30 murders spanning for decades, along with his plans to kill even more people in the coming weeks. But her immediate priority was reaching Dr. Williams before Tom Willis realized she had escaped. The veterinarian was in mortal danger, and every minute of delay increased the likelihood that he would become the conspiracy's next victim. Margaret's car was trapped at the house, surrounded by Tom Willis's men, but she remembered that her father had kept an old motorcycle in the barn, a vintage Harley-Davidson that he had restored as a hobby in his retirement years. She had learned to ride it as a teenager, much to her parents' dismay. And while she hadn't been on a motorcycle in decades, muscle memory might be enough to get her to town. The barn was on the opposite side of the property from the house, accessible through a back path that would keep her out of sight. Margaret led Daisy through the darkness, moving carefully to avoid making noise that might alert the searchers to their location. Inside the barn, she found the motorcycle exactly where her father had left it, covered by a tarp and surrounded by maintenance tools. The key was still in the ignition. Her father had always been trusting to a fault, never imagining that his own property might become a crime scene. The engine started on the third try, rumbling to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Margaret knew the noise would alert Tom Willis to her escape, but she was committed now. She had perhaps a 10-minute head start before they organized a pursuit. Daisy rode behind her, the dog's paws gripping Margaret's jacket as they navigated the back roads toward town. The October night was cold, and Margaret's hands were numb on the handlebars by the time she reached the outskirts of Millbrook. But the motorcycle had served its purpose. She had covered the distance in half the time it would have taken on foot. Dr. Williams' clinic sat on a quiet side street, its parking lot empty except for his personal vehicle. Margaret parked the motorcycle behind the building and used her phone to call him, praying he was still alive to answer. "Margaret, thank God," his voice came through clearly. "Are you safe? For now. Are you still at the clinic?" "Yes, but I don't think I should stay much longer. I've been preparing to leave for the state police headquarters, but I wanted to wait until I heard from you. Don't wait any longer. Tom Willis knows you have evidence, and he's planning to kill you within the next few days. I found his target list. Margaret could hear Dr. Williams moving around his office, gathering materials. What did you discover in the bunker? Everything. 40 years of evidence, including proof that Tom Willis has killed at least 30 people since my father died. He's been using this town as his personal hunting ground, and he's planning to eliminate all the remaining witnesses. Dear God, Margaret, we need to get this evidence to people who can act on it immediately. I agree, but first I need to warn Miss Chen. Her niece Sarah was one of Tom Willis's recent victims, and Miss Chen might be in immediate danger. Margaret heard the sound of car engines in the distance, growing closer. Tom Willis had traced her route and was searching the town systematically. Dr. Williams, they're coming. You need to leave now. What about you? Margaret looked at Daisy, whose amber eyes reflected the streetlights with their usual calm intelligence. The dog had been through so much, had carried the weight of so many secrets, without ever understanding the burden she bore. Margaret couldn't ask her to endure any more danger. I'm going to get Miss Chen to safety. Then I'm going to end this. Tom Willis has been hunting people in this town for decades, but he's never been hunted himself. It's time someone turned the tables. Margaret, that's too dangerous. Leave this to the authorities. The authorities have been part of the problem for 40 years. Tom Willis corrupted the local police. Probably has contacts in the county sheriff's department. Maybe even connections at the state level. We can't trust the system to handle this. Margaret could see headlights turning onto the street where the clinic was located. Dr. Williams, go now. Take Daisy with you. She's been through enough. I'll meet you at the state police headquarters after I finish what needs to be done here. Margaret, take care of her, Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly as she looked at the dog who had been her companion through 8 years of loneliness. She deserves a peaceful life after everything she's been through. Dr. Williams emerged from the clinic carrying a briefcase and a small overnight bag. Margaret helped Daisy into his car, kneeling beside the open door to say goodbye to the animal who had unknowingly helped solve the greatest mystery of her life. You're going home with Dr. Williams now, she whispered, stroking Daisy's golden fur one last time. You've been such a good girl, carrying all those secrets, helping us find the truth. Rest now. Daisy seemed to understand that this was goodbye, pressing her head against Margaret's chest in a gesture of affection that brought tears to the older woman's eyes. But there was no time for extended farewells. The headlights were getting closer, and Margaret needed to reach Miss Chen before Tom Willis realized where she was heading. After Dr. Williams drove away with Daisy safely in his care, Margaret retrieved her father's service weapon from the motorcycle's storage compartment. Thomas Henderson had taught both his daughters to shoot, insisting that women living in rural areas needed to be able to protect themselves. Margaret had always hoped she would never need to use those skills, but circumstances had finally made that knowledge necessary. The weight of the gun in her hand felt both foreign and familiar, a connection to her father's memory and his final attempt to make amends for his crimes. She checked the ammunition's bullets, more than enough for what she had planned. Miss Chen's house was dark when Margaret arrived, but she could see the faint glow of a television through the front window. The elderly librarian was still awake, probably unable to sleep after decades of carrying the town's darkest secrets. Margaret approached the front door carefully, checking to make sure she hadn't been followed. The street was quiet, but she knew that Tom Willis and his men would be conducting a systematic search of every location where she might seek help. When Miss Chen answered the door, her face showed both relief and terror at seeing Margaret alive. "Oh, my dear, I was so worried. There are men looking for you all over town." "I know. That's why we need to leave immediately. Tom Willis is planning to kill you, Miss Chen. He knows you have knowledge of the conspiracy, and he can't risk letting you live." The older woman nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. "I've had a bag packed for 40 years, wondering when this day would come. Let me get it." As Miss Chen gathered her belongings, Margaret used the time to make final preparations for her confrontation with Tom Willis. She had enough evidence to destroy him legally, but she also knew that he would never surrender peacefully. Men who had killed 30 people didn't simply give up when cornered. They fought back with desperate violence. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Margaret, you can't run forever. Come to the grain elevator alone, and we can discuss this like reasonable people. You have 1 hour." The message was clearly from Tom Willis, and it represented both a threat and an opportunity. He was trying to lure her to the place where the conspiracy had conducted its darkest business, probably planning to make her disappear like all the others. But Margaret had spent the evening learning from her father's mistakes, studying the evidence of 40 years of crimes, understanding how Tom Willis thought and operated. She knew something he didn't expect. She had no intention of running anymore. Instead, she was going hunting. Margaret drove Miss Chen to the county line in the librarian's car, ensuring the elderly woman would be safely away from Millbrook before the final confrontation began. Along the way, she shared copies of the evidence with Miss Chen, including detailed instructions on how to deliver it to the state police if Margaret didn't survive the night. "You don't have to do this," Miss Chen said as they sat in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, where she would wait for word from Margaret. "We have enough evidence to let the authorities handle Tom Willis." 40 years of evidence wasn't enough to stop him before, Margaret replied, checking her father's service weapon one final time. "He's too smart, too connected, too willing to kill anyone who threatens him. If I don't end this tonight, he'll find a way to escape justice and continue murdering innocent people." The truth was more complex than Margaret was willing to admit. This wasn't just about stopping a killer, it was about justice for Claire, for all the victims whose lives had been stolen, and for the decades of pain that Tom Willis had inflicted on their families. Margaret had spent 40 years believing her sister had abandoned her, when, in reality, Claire had died trying to protect the very people who had failed to save her. The grain elevator loomed against the night sky like a monument to death, its concrete tower rising nearly 100 feet above the surrounding farmland. Margaret had driven past it thousands of times without thinking about the horrors that had taken place in its shadow. But now she understood why Claire had been so frightened of this place. Margaret parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, using the farm equipment and storage buildings for cover. Tom Willis's truck was already there, along with 2 other vehicles she didn't recognize. He had brought backup, probably the same men who had been searching her property earlier. The main building was dark, but Margaret could see the faint glow of lights from the basement level where the conspiracy had conducted its business. She circled the perimeter carefully, looking for alternative entrances and escape routes that might give her an advantage in the coming confrontation. It was then that she found Tom Willis's secretor, small digital recorder hidden beneath one of the loading docks, still running and capturing audio from inside the building. He was documenting tonight's events, probably planning to use any confession or final words as evidence that Margaret had died by suicide or accident. But the recorder was two-way capable, and Margaret realized she could use it to her advantage. She activated the upload function on the device, streaming the live audio directly to a cloud storage account that would preserve whatever happened inside the grain elevator. Margaret entered through a side door that had been left unlocked, moving silently through the dusty interior of the main building. The smell was overwhelming, decades of death and decay that no amount of cleaning could ever completely eliminate. This place had been a killing ground for longer than she had imagined. Voices echoed from the basement, and Margaret crept down the metal stairs with her father's gun drawn. At the bottom, she found a scene that belonged in her worst nightmares. The basement had been converted into a sophisticated torture chamber, with restraints, tools, and recording equipment arranged around a central table. The walls were covered with photographs of victims, including Claire, arranged like trophies celebrating decades of successful murders. Tom Willis stood in the center of the room, with 2 other men, both of whom Margaret recognized as longtime Millbrook residents. They were discussing how to dispose of her body once she arrived, debating between the various methods they had perfected over the years. "She's got too much evidence," one of the men said. "Even if we kill her, someone else might find those files." "That's why we're cleaning house," Tom Willis replied coldly. "Dr. Williams dies tonight, along with the Chen woman and anyone else who might have seen the evidence. We've done this before. Few suspicious deaths, some carefully placed evidence of mental instability, and the whole thing gets written off as a tragic coincidence." Margaret stepped into the light, her father's gun aimed directly at Tom Willis's chest. "Except this time, you made a mistake. This time, someone was recording." The 3 men spun toward her, their faces showing surprise and calculation rather than fear. They had been in this situation before, had faced desperate people who thought they could bring justice through violence. "Margaret," Tom Willis said, his voice taking on the same reasonable tone he had used her entire life, You don't understand the full situation. Your father was part of this operation from the beginning. He knew what we were doing, approved of it, even helped plan some of the killings. I know exactly what my father did, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. I also know what you did to Claire, and what you've been doing to innocent people for 40 years. Tom Willis smiled coldly. Claire wasn't innocent. She was going to destroy everything we built, expose methods that kept this community safe from the kind of people who would have turned it into another crime-ridden wasteland. Safe. Margaret's voice rose slightly. You murdered 30 people, including children and journalists and anyone who asked inconvenient questions. You turned this town into your personal hunting preserve. And it worked, Tom Willis said, taking a step closer. Millbrook has the lowest crime rate in the state, the cleanest streets, the most stable property values. We did what needed to be done to protect decent people from human garbage. Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger, but she forced herself to wait. She needed him to confess everything, to provide audio evidence that would convict him, even if she didn't survive the confrontation. Tell me about Sarah Chen, Margaret demanded, keeping her gun trained on Tom Willis, while his two accomplices slowly spread out to flank her position. Tell me about the journalist you murdered last month. Tom Willis's smile widened, revealing the cold satisfaction of a predator who enjoyed reliving his kills. Sarah Chen was asking questions about missing persons cases from the 1980s. She had already connected 3 disappearances to this area and was requesting police files that would have exposed our operation. We couldn't let her continue. So, you killed her? We eliminated a threat to community stability, Tom Willis corrected. Just like we eliminated your sister when she became a problem. Just like we'll eliminate you. Margaret felt Claire's presence in that moment, as if her sister's spirit was standing beside her in the basement where she had died 40 years ago. The weight of 4 decades of injustice pressed down on her shoulders, but it also gave her strength. You're going to confess to every murder, Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority she had never possessed before. You're going to tell me where the bodies are buried, and you're going to explain how you covered up each crime. I don't think so, Tom Willis replied, nodding to his accomplices. You're outnumbered 3-1. Margaret, put the gun down and we can make this quick. But Margaret had spent the evening studying her father's files, learning from his tactical knowledge and understanding how the conspiracy operated. She knew that Tom Willis preferred to torture his victims before killing them, to extract information and enjoy their fear. That psychological need would give her the advantage she needed. You want to know what evidence I found? Margaret asked, backing toward a position where she could keep all 3 men in sight. I found recordings of Claire's murder, audio of you torturing her, of my father begging you to let her live. Tom Willis's eyes narrowed with interest despite the danger he was in. Your father was weak. He thought he could control what we did, could set limits on necessary actions. But there are no limits when you're protecting civilization from chaos. Civilization. Margaret's voice carried 40 years of accumulated rage. You murdered teenagers, Tom. You killed a 17-year-old girl because she found a piece of jewelry in the woods. Jenny Morrison was a drug addict who would have infected other young people with her poison, Tom Willis replied coldly. Her death prevented dozens of future crimes, probably saved multiple families from destruction. Margaret realized that Tom Willis genuinely believed his own justifications, that he had convinced himself that mass murder was a form of public service. The recording device would capture every word of his confession, but she needed more than admissions. She needed the locations of burial sites so that families could finally have closure. Where did you bury them? Margaret demanded. Where are the bodies? Scattered across 3 counties, Tom Willis said proudly. Some fed to livestock, some dissolved in acid, some burned to ash and scattered. We perfected disposal methods that your father never had the stomach for. One of his accomplices was moving closer, trying to get behind Margaret's position. She shifted her aim toward him, causing him to freeze in place. But she knew the standoff couldn't last much longer. Eventually, one of them would make a move, and the confined space of the basement would turn into a killing ground. Sarah Chun's body, Margaret pressed. Where is it? At the bottom of Whispering Creek, weighted down with chains. The fish have probably cleaned the bones by now. The casual way he described the disposal of human remains made Margaret's stomach turn, but she forced herself to continue the interrogation. Every detail he provided would help investigators recover evidence and bring closure to victim families. How many others in the current operation? Just the three of us now, Tom Willis said. Your father's death allowed us to streamline the organization, eliminate the weak links who might have compromised security. Margaret realized that Tom Willis was stalling, keeping her talking while his accomplices maneuvered for better positions, but she had achieved what she needed: a complete confession that would convict him of multiple murders, recorded and automatically uploaded to secure storage where it couldn't be destroyed. One last question, Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Did Claire suffer? Tom Willis's smile became genuinely sadistic. She begged for her life, right until the end. Called out for your father, for you, for anyone who might save her. But no one came, Margaret. No one cared enough to save her then, and no one will save you now. The attack came from two directions, simultaneously. Tom Willis, lunging directly at her while one of his accomplices tried to tackle her from the side. But Margaret had been preparing for this moment all evening, channeling her father's tactical training and 40 years of suppressed rage into deadly focus. She shot Tom Willis center mass, the impact of the bullet spinning him backward into the wall of victim photographs. The second shot caught his accomplice in the shoulder, dropping him to the concrete floor. The third man surrendered immediately, his hands raised and his face white with terror. Margaret stood over Tom Willis as he lay dying among the pictures of his victims, including Claire's photographs, staring down at them both. Justice had finally come to Millbrook, carried out in the same basement where so many innocent people had breathed their last. Claire, Margaret whispered, her voice carrying all the love and loss of 4 decades. I finally got him. I finally made him pay. In the distance, she could hear sirens approaching. Dr. Williams had alerted the state police as planned, and help was on the way. The nightmare that had consumed Millbrook for 40 years was finally over. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the garden behind her new cottage on Elm Street, watching Daisy chase butterflies among the wildflowers they had planted together. The golden retriever moved with renewed vitality, her spirit lighter somehow. After Dr. Williams had removed the last of the embedded evidence from her body, she was truly free now, carrying only the joy of the present moment instead of the weight of the past. The trials had been a media sensation, drawing reporters from across the country to the small town that had harbored such dark secrets. Margaret had testified for 3 days, her voice steady as she described 40 years of systematic murder and cover-up. The evidence from her father's bunker had proven overwhelming. Tom Willis's surviving accomplice had pleaded guilty in exchange for revealing the locations of burial sites, allowing families to finally lay their loved ones to rest. 30-7 bodies had been recovered so far, with more searches planned as investigators followed leads from the extensive documentation Tom Willis had kept. Each discovery brought both closure and renewed grief to families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their children, siblings, and friends. Margaret's old farmhouse had been donated to the state as a memorial site, transformed into a center for families of missing persons. The underground bunker had become a museum of sorts, its grim contents serving as a reminder of how easily ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary. Eveville. Dr. Williams stopped by most evenings after his clinic closed, bringing medical supplies for the small animal rescue operation Margaret had started in Claire's memory. They would sit on the porch drinking coffee and watching Daisy play, finding comfort in quiet conversation and shared understanding of what they had survived together. Any word from the victims' families? Dr. Williams asked as he settled into the chair beside Margaret's. Mrs. Morrison called this morning, Margaret replied, referring to Jenny Morrison's mother. They're finally having a proper funeral service next week. After 40 years, she can stop wondering and start grieving properly. The healing process had been different for each family. Some had found peace in finally knowing the truth, while others struggled with anger that justice had taken so long. Margaret understood both reactions. She had experienced them herself in the months since Tom Willis's death. Miss Chen had returned to Millbrook after the trials, her fear finally replaced by a quiet sense of resolution. She had established a scholarship fund in her niece Sarah's name, helping young journalists pursue investigations into cold cases and unsolved crimes. The librarian had also begun work on a book documenting the conspiracy, determined to ensure that the full truth would be preserved for future generations. Eleanor Pattison visited regularly, bringing fresh vegetables from her garden and updates on the town's slow process of healing. Many longtime residents had left Millbrook after the trials, unable to live with the knowledge of what had happened in their community, but others had stayed, committed to rebuilding their town's reputation and ensuring that such darkness could never take root again. "I got a letter from Claire's friend Linda," Margaret said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "She lives in Oregon now, has 3 grandchildren. She wanted me to know that she never believed Claire had run away, that she always suspected something terrible had happened." Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "It's remarkable how many people had pieces of the truth but were too afraid to speak up. Tom Willis created an atmosphere of fear that lasted for decades." Margaret had wrestled with anger toward the silent witnesses, the people who had suspected the truth but chosen safety over justice. But she had gradually come to understand their impossible position. Speaking up would have meant certain death, and silence at least allowed them to protect their own families. The financial settlement from the state had been substantial, compensation for the decades of official negligence that had allowed the conspiracy to operate. Margaret had used most of the money to establish the Claire Henderson Foundation, providing resources for missing persons investigations and support for victim families. But it was the small moments of healing that meant the most to Margaret. The handwritten thank you notes from family members, the phone calls from other towns where similar investigations had been launched, the knowledge that Claire's death had finally served a purpose in bringing justice to others. Daisy trotted over to the porch, carrying a stick she wanted someone to throw. Margaret obliged, watching the dog bound joyfully across the yard in pursuit of her prize. It was impossible to look at Daisy now and remember the horror of learning what she had carried in her body for so many years. The dog had moved forward, with the resilience that only animals seemed to possess, living fully in each moment without the burden of traumatic memory. "She's beautiful when she runs," Dr. Williams observed, smiling at Daisy's enthusiasm. "She's beautiful all the time," Margaret replied. "I think she knows she's safe now, that the bad things are finally over." As the sun set behind the trees, Margaret reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment of peace. 8 months ago, she had been a lonely widow living in the shadow of unresolved grief, her days marked by routine and the quiet acceptance of loss. The discovery of Buster's dog tag had shattered that carefully constructed calm, forcing her to confront truths that had been buried for 4 decades. But from that chaos had come clarity. From that pain had emerged purpose. Margaret's life now had meaning beyond her own survival. She was part of a network of advocates and investigators, working to prevent future tragedies and solve cold cases around the country. Claire's bedroom in the old farmhouse had been preserved as part of the memorial, but Margaret no longer needed that shrine to remember her sister. She carried Claire's memory in her daily work for justice, in her advocacy for victim families, in her determination to ensure that no one else would suffer in silence as their family had. The cottage felt like home, in a way. The farmhouse never had again after learning its secrets. Here, Margaret could build new memories untainted by the past, could create a future worthy of Claire's sacrifice. As Daisy settled at her feet with a contented sigh, Margaret opened the letter from Claire's friend and began to read about a life well lived, children raised with love, and the enduring power of friendship to survive even the darkest losses. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families seeking answers, new opportunities to honor Claire's memory through service to others. But tonight, Margaret was content to sit on her porch with her beloved dog, finally at peace with the past and ready to embrace whatever the future might hold.